Good evening. I want to welcome everybody to the Saturday class series at LaRouche PAC. I'm Susan Kokinda, and tonight I'm joined by Pat Ruckert, who is going to be continuing in what has been a several-week series examining the principles of classical tragedy. Last week, Pat began to introduce us to a great American patriot and artist, James Fenimore Cooper, who played a vital role in the first half of the 19th century in the United States and in the world, both as a political organizer who fought to defend the principles of our republic, and as a classical dramatist whose works were among the most popular in the world in some of the decades of the early part of the 19th century. Last week, Pat introduced us to some of Cooper's political organizing and the scope of his work. This week, we're going to dive more deeply into the principles of classical tragedy, especially as they are unfolded in a number of Cooper's novels written when he was in Europe and set in European settings, which look very dramatically at the evils of the oligarchical system and the contrast of that to what had been created in the United States as the first republic in the world. And by way of setting the current stage, in a sense, for this discussion, I want to point to one development that occurred this week, or the release of a horrifying statistic here in the United States. On Tuesday, the Centers for Disease Control released the statistics for drug overdoses in 2021. It's over 106,000 of our fellow Americans passed away of drug overdoses. This is 15% higher than 2020, and it's the highest recorded number since statistics have been kept. Now, obviously, one question that has to be asked is, how did we get here? And one can look at a variety of different causes, all of which are real. Obviously, the fact that our border is completely open and fentanyl and other drugs, but right now the most deadly drug in this epidemic is fentanyl, is pouring over a completely porous border. You can look at the atomization, the depersonalization of our society, which is also a very, very real aspect of this, especially when you look at some of the younger generations and the culture that they have been raised in. You can look at the role of the international banks in financing opium wars over the years. And as our organization documented back in the 1970s to this very day, major international banks, especially British-related banks like Hong Kong and Shanghai, and their sisters and brothers here in the United States, were and continue to be major financiers of the illegal drug trade. You can look at the role of Big Pharma in addicting people to opioids and painkillers and so on. These are all real, and they have created a truly tragic situation here in the United States. But if we're going to actually be able to deal with this, we have to go beyond the description of a tragic circumstances. And we have to delve into the principles of classical tragedy, which seeks to take you deeper into what is wrong on a more fundamental level with a culture, with the worldview of a population or a ruling strata. And from that standpoint, you can look at the role of the British Empire, for example, as a major force in the propagation of drugs in the world, both as is historically known from the standpoint of the Opium War in China, but more recently, as I said, as we've documented, carrying out essentially a new war against the American population over the recent numbers of decades. But that stems from an evil view of mankind, because the imperial outlook or the oligarchical outlook looks at a human being merely as another animal, an animal to be controlled through pleasure or an animal to be culled, but merely an animal to be managed as part of a continuing system of imperial control. Our republic was founded on a very, very different conception. Western civilization is founded on a very, very different conception, which is that it is man's creative power which must be given the freedom to flourish. And this was the intention of the creation of our republic. And that is something that James Fenimore Cooper both celebrated in his novels, but I think certainly exemplified in his person. So again, the question of classical tragedy is not simply a tragic occurrence, but rather, as we discussed last week, equipping you in the audience to look at what is unfolding, whether it's on the stage or whether it's in the pages of a book which you're reading, and cause you to reflect on what are the unseen ideas and principles which are driving the characters in the play or in the book to the tragic ends that are inevitable because they are unaware of what is actually driving them. And the purpose of tragedy is to cause you to be aware of these deeper driving forces, such that you, as a citizen of a republic, are able to deliberate and make the changes in our policy in order to avoid those tragic consequences for yourself, for your family, or for your nation. And that, I think, is really the most important contribution that a great figure like James Fenimore Cooper can play today, as we're faced with the challenge of rescuing our own republic from the grip of tragic principles. So I think Pat is going to take us on a very interesting journey tonight, and I want to just turn it right over to him.
Thank you, Susan. If people were on last week, I began with the idea of classical art, and I just want to repeat a little bit of that for now. That whereas in Europe, in oligarchical empire nations or straight on empires, a generally tyrannical form of government dominates. And for those creative and moved and motivated individuals, artistic creativity, great classical art, takes generally the form of music, architecture, paintings. Whereas in the young United States, and continuing, especially for the next century following the American Revolution, the greatest expressions of art actually reflect one of the statements in Friedrich Schiller's Aesthetical Letters, where he said that the greatest and most powerful work of art is the creation of political freedom. And that we saw. And once again, we do need to see that expression of true political freedom ensures that this republic and others who are created in our image, essentially, actually not only flourishes, but at the same time ensures that the kind of crises that we're in right now and the insanity of the Biden administration, especially in regard to the conflict with Russia and Ukraine, does not literally destroy the human race in a nuclear war. So I presented then last week some of the words from the Declaration of Independence, the preamble of the US Constitution, the speeches of Lincoln at Gettysburg, his inaugural address. And I said that these are the works of art that represented the American Republic, but that great works of art in paintings, in music, and in literature have been always part of the American history. And therefore, what we want to do tonight is actually discuss two of Cooper's novels. One, the Bravo, and the second, the Heidenmauer. And we'll go through those a little bit and then leave plenty of time for discussion, questions, and dialogue. But Cooper was in Europe from 1826 to 1833, 7 years. And what was going on in Europe at that time? There was an upsurge of Republican political action, movements, discussion, and Cooper was in the middle of that. He partnered with the Marquis de Lafayette, who fought in the American Revolution side by side with George Washington, right? And there were other Americans there too. I'll just mention one of them right now, Samuel Grinley Howe, who spent a few years in Greece working Republican movements there. In 1830-31, from Paris, Cooper sent him to deliver some funds contributed by Americans to the Polish revolutionaries. He was detained in Germany for a month and then finally freed. But who was he? He was a doctor. He came back to the United States. He founded the first school for the deaf in the United States. And his wife, I forget her name, but his wife was the composer or the author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And Samuel Grinley Howe himself headed up Lincoln's Sanitary Commission, which was the medical corps for the Union Army during the Civil War. So you see, there's a continuity that flows from these same individuals who took upon themselves the kind of leadership and initiatives that made this country what it is today. So with that, let's move to the Bravo. And the Bravo is 1831, after Cooper had spent several years making an intense study of the political structures of Europe, of feudalism, of the monarchy, and an emerging oligarchy that was tied into increasingly not only the Venetian financial structures, but also the emerging, actually well-established British Empire itself. And what he determined through his study was that it really wasn't monarchy that ran the countries and the empires of Europe. It was an oligarchy. And the intention of the oligarchy, as clearly stated in the Treaty of Vienna of 1815, following the Napoleonic Wars, was to ensure that republicanism gains no ground in Europe, and that eventually, and in some way, that the virus, the origin of the virus of republicanism, the United States of America, would be actually destroyed. And so in that rising Republican wave through the late 1820s and into the early 1830s, Cooper then in 1831 published the Bravo. And what we'll look at is a little bit of background on that. But first, what is it he's really trying to get at? Well, as he said, as he wrote at one point, fictional works are a formidable weapon in the cause of morality. And that was especially clear in the case of the novel, The Bravo. And the response of especially British critics, actually underlined how dangerous they considered Cooper's work and himself to be to an oligarchical system. Now, if we put, but anyway, in terms of the Bravo, he wrote, that I consider the Bravo not only the best book I have ever written, but the most American. Right now, that's somewhat ironic, maybe, as we start, but his commitment to the Republic and was to issue a warning to the American people of the growing power of a financial class in the United States that in some ways, in his mind, represented the beginning of the creation of an oligarchical class within the country itself. Now, if we put the first quotation from the American Democrat, you see a little bit more of his thinking and what he's actually thinking of. This was written in 1838. He said, one may certainly be purse proud, and of all the sources of human pride, mere wealth is the basest and of the most vulgar minded. A people that deems the possession of riches its highest source of distinction admits one of the most degrading of all influences to preside over its opinions. At no time should money ever be ranked as more than a means, and he who lives as if the acquisition of property were the sole end of his existence betrays the dominion of the most sordid, base, and groveling motive that offers. Property is desirable as the groundwork of moral independence, as a means of improving the faculties and of doing good to others, and against the agent in all that distinguishes the civilized man from the savage. So you get a sense of what he not only how he thought, but he's very explicit in what he thinks. And that made him a target, not only of the British, but also the British influenced media of the United States. And remember, I quoted Cooper last week as stating that the newspaper men are the funguses of letters that flourish on the dunghill of the common mind. So what he said then, of course, applies today. So he not only considered the Bravo the best book he had ever written, but it was written after a 2-week stay in Venice in the 1830s. And the title refers to a purported assassin and spy in the employ of the Venetian state. His name is, he's called Jacobo. And at the time of the story, early 1700s, what was Venice? Well, it still was the most powerful empire in Europe. It looted the world, created and destroyed other empires, and enslaved millions through a highly refined system of manipulation, supported by military force and an internal order for Venice itself, that the so-called Serene Republic was maintained by one of the most ruthless, cruel, cynical, and faceless systems of government ever devised. At the center of the Venetian system was the Inquisition. It was named the Council of Three. Now, was the United States actually threatened by Venice in the 1830s? Certainly not. But it is increasingly the threat that Cooper saw developing inside the United States of a self-perpetuating money power. And he's warning the American population, of that growing power that actually is a threat to the Republic. He later wrote, the object was to lay bare the wrongs that are endured by the weak when power is the exclusive property of the strong. The irresponsible and ruthless movement of an aristocracy, the manner in which the selfish and wicked profit by its facilities, and in which even the good become passive instruments of its soulless power. So Venice called itself a republic. And Cooper reminds his American audience that European so-called republics have frequently been prostituted to the protection and monopolies of privileged classes. So let's actually look at the quotes from the Bravo that give a further description of the Venetian system. He says, with the painful conviction that many of my own countrymen were influenced by the fallacies that a nation can be governed by an irresponsible minority without involving a train of nearly intolerable abuses, I determined to attempt a series of tales in which American opinion should be brought to bear on European facts. With this design, the Bravo was written, Venice being its scene, and her polity its subject. Venice, though ambitious and tenacious in the name of a republic, was in truth a narrow, a vulgar, and an exceedingly heartless oligarchy. To the former title, she had no other claim than her denial of the naked principle already mentioned, while her practice is liable to the reproach of the two latter in the unmanly and narrow character of its exclusion in every act of her foreign policy, and in every measure of an internal police. Thus, there existed at all times in the heart of Venice a mysterious and despotic power that was wielded by men who moved in society unknown and apparently surrounded by all the ordinary charities of life, but which, in truth, was influenced by a set of political maxims that were perhaps as ruthless, as tyrannic, and as selfish as ever were invented by the evil ingenuity of man. So the story is fairly complex, but in summary, it takes place over really just a few days, maybe a week or two or three. And the story is of the Bravo, or the spy, the assassin, which is what the Venetians called those that he had hired to engage in such practices, the Bravo. And what the Bravo is supposedly, and has the reputation throughout the city of Venice, as an assassin. But he's not really what he appears to be. And in many Cooper's novels, what a certain character appears to be, in the end, we find out that's not what he was. He was something quite different. So the story has several main characters. Antonio, an older fisherman whose son had died in the Venetian Wars, and his 14-year-old grandson was enslaved in the Venetian ships as one of 100 or more, literally chained to the oars of the boat. And Antonio, very old, a boatman who would pick up people and deliver them in his gondola. He was a fisherman. He was pleading with the rulers of Venice to release his grandson because he was getting old. He needed the grandson in his old age. And a regatta early in the novel is held, and a race of the best oarsmen of the city. And the Bravo, disguised in a mask, a few others of prominent name, and Antonio enters the race. And everyone looks at him and said, he's an old man, he can't do anything. What's he doing there? And the race, as many action scenes in Cooper's novels, grips you, and you almost feel like you're there, which is the kind of imagination that Cooper wants to evoke in his readers as much as possible, to bring you into the action, bring you into the participation of the struggle that people like Antonio are actually making. So toward the end of the race, the Bravo, in his disguise, no one knows who is this guy who's head of the race. He deliberately slows down a little bit and lets Antonio win. Antonio then is supposed to go up to the Doge, the head of state of Venice, really nothing but a figurehead. And in a big ceremony, he's supposed to have been awarded the victory. But he interrupts it, and he pleads to the Doge to let his grandson free from the Venetian galleys. And that completely disrupts the not only the ceremony, but is an outrage against the rulers of Venice, who expect dutiful and always obedient servants among the population. So he's on the blacklist now. And a secondary plot is with a relatively decent oligarch, as we can say, the Duke Camille Monforte. And his family left Venice, even though they were senators in the council. And he came back now to recover the property of the family. But then something happens. A orphaned heiress, Violetto, in a boating accident, almost drowns, and Don Camille jumps in and saves her. And a love story develops between the two. But she's a wealthy heiress, orphan, and the Venetian state are the ones who are going to choose her husband for whatever political and financial property gains they can actually make. And so the plot, I won't go through all the plot. I don't want to kill the interest in the novel for you. But a monk who is the confessor to the young lady is drafted by the state one night, put in a boat, and the boat goes out into the broad canal and comes up to the boat of the fisherman Antonio. And when this monk realizes that they're going to drown Antonio, he has no choice but to take the confession of Antonio and get back into the state's boat. And a splash is heard. And of course, Antonio drowns. The Bravo witnessed this. And without giving up some of the mystery here, the Bravo is not whom he's made to appear. I think, as I said a few minutes ago. And then, so he then secretly begins to aid the Don Camille and the young woman in an attempt to escape Venice. And then there's all kinds of going back and forth, up and down, chases and everything else going through this. But in the end, the Bravo is then officially condemned by the Council of Three, as the murder of Antonio. And in the end, and you can see it coming, so I'm not going to hide it, in a public square, the Bravo is executed with the guillotine. And if we put up the, I think the last one in terms of text, it's not just the Venetian aristocracy or oligarchy that is corrupted. All of Venice acquiescence in both from its fear and its tradition. It seeks to live within the system. So the Bravo is executed, and within hours, the population of Venice returns to its sensuous pleasures, and of necessity behind the mask of anonymity. So the last paragraph in the Bravo, the porticos become brilliant with lamps, the gay laugh, the reckless trifle, the masker pursued his hidden purpose. The cantarise and the grotesque acted their parts, and the millions existed in that vacant enjoyment which distinguishes the pleasures of the thoughtless and the idle. Each lived for himself, while the state of Venice held its vicious sway, corrupting alike the ruler and the ruled by the mockery of those sacred principles which alone are founded in truth and natural justice. Now, in the course of the novel, Cooper provides us an amazing map of the thinking processes of the oligarchical mind. Since this sense of personal identity of an oligarch is located not within his own thinking processes, but in the social structure of the oligarchy itself. Universal principles of real law, nothing like that defines the individual self-conception, nor even any internally defined purpose. He's totally other-directed, a mere tool or appendage for maintaining the continuity of the oligarchical system. Thus, for the oligarch, there's no universal or higher purpose to his individual life. An obligation to principles, law, or justice, nothing, no matter how bestial or obscene, is forbidden. Of course, in Venice, one should not embarrass the family with one's lawless behavior. Thus, masks of the Venetians disguise the perpetrator of evil while permitting and condoning the act. As Lyndon LaRouche said many decades ago, the stink of Venice, the Venetian canals, exposed the most vicious and evil governmental system ever created. So with that, we'll move on to the second book called The Heidenmauer. And this is different. The Heidenmauer takes place in the Rhine area of the Rhine River area of Bavaria in the 1520s, and centered on the small town of Durkheim, a Benedictine abbey, and Count Lettinger's castle. And so what you have in this is a three-way kind of social conflict underway. And this is 1520. This is the emergence of Luther and the Protestant Reformation. And Germany especially is being torn to pieces by this religious controversy. And so the church, through the Benedictines, the aristocracy, like through the princes and minor nobility, and an emerging merchant class, all interacting, all seeking its own interests in whatever narrow way that's actually seen. And in the process, what we see, and this is a real tragedy, is a conflict that completely completely engulfs the entirety of the populations of all three sectors of the society. And Cooper's introduction, which I'm going to put up on the screen if Susan has it there, actually reflects, as we see in many of his novels, his study of history, his study of political, social, and religious institutions. And what you have in the center of this novel is is not only the town of Durkheim, but nearby is the abbey of the Benedictines, and somewhat in between the castle of the prince, the abbey, and the town are several distinctive elements. One's called the Heidenmauer, which is from the title of the book. Translated means the pagan's wall. And there's ruins there of a centuries old military camp. And also there is what is called generally it's called by the residents the Devil's Stone. Another legend that provides a little superstition for the residents, and especially the peasants and small shopkeepers and artisans there. So in the introduction, Cooper writes, as he's actually introduced to this area, and what he's writing is a historical novel. You know, the general character of the events of the novel actually occurred. And he visited Durkheim, and he was shown or told about, you know, these unique formations that are on the hill nearby. And so a guide takes him up there, and so he writes in the introduction, "The rock recalled the age of furious superstition and debased ignorance, the time when the country lay in forest over which the hunter ranged at will, contending with the beast for the mystery of his savage domain. Still, the noble creature bore the image of God, and occasionally some mastermind pierced the shades, catching glimpses of that eternal truth which pervades nature. Then followed the Romans with its gods of plausible attributes, his ingenious and specious philosophy, his accumulated and borrowed art, his concerted and overwhelming action, his love of magnificence, so grand in its effects, but so sordid and unjust in its means. And last, the most impressive of all, that beacon-like ambition which wrecked his hopes on the sea of its vastness, and with the evidence of the falsity of his system as furnished in his fall. The memorial before me showed the means by which he gained and lost his power. The barbarian had been taught in the bitter school of experience to regain his rights, and in the excitement of the moment, it was not difficult to imagine the Huns pouring into the Roman camp and calculating their chances of success by the vestiges they found of the ingenuity and resources of their foes. So So with that, let's look at actually the plot, the people involved, and again, without opening up to you the conclusion or the story, all the story and the most exciting elements of it, I do want to actually give you a sense of the characters. You had, of course, the Emmett Leninger, the count and the top oligarch for the region. You had Father Siegfried, a Benedictine from the Abbey of Limburg, and you have Dietrich Heinrich Frey, who is the head of the head honcho in the town. His wife, his daughter. You have one of the servants of Lemminger, the count, named Gottlob Frink, who is a cowherd, and then Berkhold Heidenmauer, a forest and huntsman, who also was in the employ of the count. So with that, just to give you a little bit of it, people of the town and the count were very jealous of the monks in the Benedictine Abbey, which was a very large fortress-like structure. And there may have been 100 monks there or something like that. But they taxed the village residents. They owned most of the grapevines, the vineyards of the area, and the count enlists the village into an attack on the Benedictine Abbey. And the plot, goes interesting and somewhat humorous often, of how everybody is wanting to do something, but they don't want to say it openly. And but then the village, a few hundred men are recruited to the small army the count has, and one night they attack. And they not only destroy virtually everything in the abbey, but then they burn all the buildings. And one of the monks refuses to leave the main cathedral, and he dies in the fire that actually occurs there. Now, the love story is between the daughter of Heinrich Frey, her name is Mita, and the forester and huntsman, Berthold Heidenmauer. And again, without revealing the ins and outs of all that, or the concluding element that surprises everybody. And I know I just reread it for the first time in 20 years or so. And the ending completely surprised me again, which I'd forgotten about. So, but there's a lot of, put it this way, that in a tragedy, there are no heroes. Right? Everybody is a fool. Everybody is a coward. Everybody gets fooled. And everybody's manipulating everybody else. Right? So if you remember Bruce Director's class a few weeks ago on Schiller's 30-year history of the 30 Years' War and the and Schiller's play on that. 30 Years' War, 1618, 1648. But it really began here in the 1520s with the emergence of Protestantism and the conflict it began creating within the populations. So and all the people who seem to be fairly steady, solid types of people are, like in all mass movements that are aimed at something really bad, those who actually participate would not do what they did as individuals, but they're caught up in the moment. They're caught up in the riot, so to speak. And if we look at more broadly this entire period, we do get a picture of what Lyndon LaRouche called historical specificity. That is, you get inside the actual thinking and culture of the period, and it allows you to understand much better how these kinds of developments actually occurred. So it is a work of classical tragedy, a tragedy that the more decent characters, some even acting with great personal courage in the chaos that's unleashed against the brutishness, the evil that is actually carried out by hundreds of people, who would not do that to their neighbor in a normal moment. So the susceptibility of populations to manipulation of their ignorance, their fears, and their selfish interests is what is actually most instructive in understanding what Cooper's trying to create within the American population. Now, the novel was the second of 3 novels that Cooper wrote in Europe with the same purpose, to give the Americans a sense of the danger of where they would be going. Now, since 1831, 1832, the president of the United States is Andrew Jackson. Jackson is ripping to pieces the American system economic policy established by Alexander Hamilton and actually put into real action from 1825 through 1829 by President John Quincy Adams. But Jackson, mobilizing the same kind of people who were mobilized in Durkheim to burn down the abbey and actually kill one of the monks, had taken over the United States. And Andrew Jackson destroyed the Second National Bank of the United States, throwing the country into economic, financial anarchy. And we paid for that, or the citizens then paid for it, with the biggest financial collapse up till then in US history, the collapse of 1837. And so if we get a sense of what Cooper was looking at, and the irony here for Cooper is that he was actually a supporter of Andrew Jackson, but not Jacksonianism, not at manipulating the mob and of actually destroying what is critical to a Republican form of government. That is reasoning and not putting forth the kind of sophistry, propaganda, manipulation of fears, manipulation of narrow interest that Jackson well exemplified as Prince Limminger in the Heidenmauer does to the people of the town. So we saw Susan put up the actual remains of the abbey just a minute ago or so. And so I want to actually end with one more thing, and that is give you a little example of how Cooper really was a classical historian and classical dramatist. And we will early in the novel, Gottlob, the cowherd for the Lord, is walking with Father Siegfried, one of the Benedictine monks from the Abbey of Limburg. And the monk is probing Gottlob on the state of mind of the people of the village of Durkheim, in regard to this dispute between the Lord and the monks. The monk began the dialogue under the assumption that the cowherd is little more than an illiterate peasant. So what comes clearly seen in the dialogue between the two is the irony, humor, misunderstanding, the ulterior motives, and the intention of the monk is to recruit Gottlob into becoming a spy for the Benedictines and warning them of what Lord Emich is planning to do, what his forces are. And so the monk begins the dialogue, essentially under the illusion that the cowherd is an illiterate peasant. So they're walking back from a visit to a hermit's little shack located somewhere on the Heidenmauer by the Pagan's Wall, etc. Now, Father Siegfried has a cautious, if not deceitful, intent. Gottlob is more honest in his intentions, a much more transparent character, not innocent or naive, but his more personal motive and narrow identity becomes clear. So the dialogue begins with Gottlob mentioning that he is from the village of Durkheim, and the monk then begins the dialogue. So we're going to do this for a few minutes, and I will be Gottlob, and Susan will be, no, Susan's going to be Gottlob, and I will be the monk. So let us begin. Okay, Gottlob, since you namest Durkheim, canst say aught of the humor of its people in this matter of contention between our holy abbot and Emich of Hardenberg?
Were I to tell thy reverence the truth that lies deepest in my mind, it would be to say that the burghers wish to see the affair brought to an end in such a way as to leave no doubt hereafter to which party they owe most obedience and love, since they find it a little hard upon their zeal to have so large demands of these services made by both parties.
Thou canst not serve God and Mammon, son. So saith one who could not deceive.
And so saith reason too, worshipful monk. But to give thee at once my inmost soul, I believe there is not a man in our Durkheim who believes himself strong enough in learning to say, in this strife of duties, which is God and which is Mammon.
How? Do they call in question our sacred mission, our divine embassy? In short, our being what we are?
No man is so bold as to say that the monks of Limburg are what they are. They might be irreverent to the church and indecent of Father Siegfried. And the most we dare say is that they seem to be what they are. And that is no small matter, considering the way things go in this world. Seem to be, Gottlob, said my poor father, and thou wilt escape envy and enemies. For in this seemliness, there is nothing so alarming to others. It is only when one is really the thing itself that men begin to find fault. If thou wishest to live peaceably with thy neighbors, push nothing beyond seeming to be, for that much all will bear, since all can seem. Whereas being oftentimes sets a whole village in an uproar. It is wonderful the virtue there is in seeming, and heartburnings and scandal, aye, and the downright quarrels there are in being just what one seems. No, the most we say in Durkheim is that the monks of Limburg seem to be men of God.
And Lord Imish?
As to Count Image, Father, we hold it wise to remember that he is a great noble. The elector has not a bolder knight, nor the emperor a truer vassal. We say, therefore, that he seems to be brave and loyal.
Thou makest great account, son, of these apparent qualities.
Knowing the frailty of man, Father, and the great likelihood of error, when we wish to judge of acts and reasons that lie deeper than our knowledge, we hold it to be the most prudent. No, let us of Durkheim alone as men of caution.
For a cowherd, thou wantest not wit. Canst read?
By God's favor, Providence put that little accident in my way when a child, Reverend Monk, and I picked it up as I might swallow a sweet morsel.
'Tis a gift more likely to injure than to serve one of thy calling. The art can do little benefit to thy herd.
I will not take it upon myself to say that any of the cattle are much better for it, though to deal fairly by thee, Reverend Benedictine, there are animals among them that seem to be.
How? Wilt thou attempt to show a fact not only improbable, but impossible? Go to. Thou hast fallen upon some silly work of a jester. There have been numberless of these commissions of the devil poured forth since the discovery of the imprudent brother of mines. I would gladly hear in what manner a beast can profit by the art of printing.
Thy patience, Father Siegfried, and thou shalt know. Now there is a hind that can read, and there is one that cannot. We will suppose them both be the servants of Emmich of Hartenberg. Well, they go forth of a morning with their herds, this taking the path to the hills of the Count, and that, having read the description of the boundaries between the Lord's land and that of the holy abbot of Limburg, taking another, because learning will not willingly follow ignorance, whereupon the reader reaches a nearer and better pasture than he who hath gone about to feed upon ground that has only been trodden upon too often before by hoof of beast and foot of man.
Thy learning had not done much toward clearing thy head, Gottlob, whatever it may have done to the condition of thy herd.
If your worship has any doubts of my being what I say, here is proof of its justice then. I know nothing that so crams a man and confuses him as learning. He who has but one horn can take it and go his way, whereas he that hath many may lose his herd while choosing between instruments that are better or worse. He that hath but one sword will draw it and slay his enemy. But he that hath much armor may lose his life while putting on his buckler or his headpiece.
I had not thought thee so skillful in answer. And thou thinkest the good people of Durkheim will stand neuter between the abbey and the count?
Father, if thou wilt show me by which side they will be the greatest gainers, I think I might venture to say with some certainty on which side they will be likely to draw the sword. Our burghers are prudent townsmen, as I have said, and it is not often that they are found fighting against their own interests.
Okay, that's the end of that dialogue, and I think we should open it up to some discussion and questions and comments.